Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Archdale Expositor. I'm your host, Russ McCullough, coming to you live this morning from Williamsburg, Virginia. And welcome to the broadcast. We come to you on behalf of the Archdale Church of Christ that will meet again tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. And the meeting is at 2525 Archdale Drive in Charlotte, 28210. And we'll have Bible study there at 11. I hope and pray you can be there. So keep that in mind. Put it on your calendar. Check it out. By the way, because of my absence, we will not have a broadcast on Wednesday evening. So no class on Wednesday evening, but tomorrow morning, 11, we'll be there. Okay, so we just wanted to continue our discussion on what we're calling expository study or expositional study of the Bible, which is the basis for biblical study, the basis for biblical preaching, and the basis for biblical teaching. Many people have neglected biblical teaching and biblical study, biblical preaching for a long time, due to a number of factors. Perhaps one factor more than any other is the division of the scripture into chapters and verses, which are very useful to find things, but are not useful in understanding and studying the scripture, because the text and the context gets easily lost when you chop text into separate chapters and separate verses. And if you haven't noticed, and I'm sure you have, that many sentences in the Bible are chopped up. They're not even an individual verse is not even a complete sentence. And so when we teach and preach and study in these artificial divisions, it can be difficult. And so we want to make sure we use the best possible Bible study tools, the best possible Bible class preparation, and the best possible sermon preparation that we can obtain. And that is to preach straight from the text in its complete context. And we've identified the various context that we need to make sure that we understand when we're studying any particular text. And one of the most important text is that we need to understand is the book context. If we're looking at Genesis, we need to look at Genesis as a whole and discover what is the propositional context of Genesis. What is it? The theme of Genesis. In fact, the entire Bible is Genesis 12, where God promises Abram in verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and bless and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The promise of Jesus Christ and the deliverance of Jesus Christ and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is the theme of the book of Genesis and entire Bible as well. So with that understood, we can better understand any particular segment of Genesis that we choose to look at. And this morning, I want us to illustrate something very important that might elude us otherwise. That is the sacrifice of Cain and Abel. Now, we talk about Cain and Abel a lot, generally speaking, about the evils of murder, and it certainly was an evil thing. Abel is considered righteous, and though he is dead, he still speaks, and we understand and appreciate that. Good morning to those who are listening. Thank you. We understand that, but there's something about this that is far more important, because it speaks to blood sacrifice. And so I want to read the text in its context, and the transitional word at verse 1 in chapter 4 is important. It says, now Adam. That means, among other things, a break from what previously had been discussed. Of course, when Genesis was written, there were no sentences, there were no chapters, and there were no verses. It's just one long dialogue. And so immediately before this is noted, God has driven Adam and Eve out of the garden, verse 24 of chapter 3. And then chapter 4 begins a new, completely new context and text. Chapter 4, verse 1 is the beginning, and the end is, let's see where we are. At verse 16, because in verse 17, it begins a different subject where it talks about the lineage of Cain. So the text in its context for Cain and Abel's sacrificial difficulties on the part of Cain, and the cause of the murder of Abel out of jealousy. Chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 16 is the complete text in its context. And we're going to just look at one aspect of this, because each portion of Scripture has something important it wants us to understand. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and by the way, we're reading from the English Standard Version, or as I like to say, the English Standard Translation. The ESV is not a version. A version is a rewriting of a translation that's already in existence, whereas a translation goes back to the original language and translates it into a different language. So it's the English Standard Translation to be accurate. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit from the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. We're not going to read the rest of the text, because the passage we want to focus on is this sacrifice. Why was God pleased with Abel's sacrifice and displeased with Cain's? Well, it has to do with scriptural example and command. And you say, well, what are you talking about? You recall in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned, God covered the sin of Adam and Eve with the skin of an animal. Well, what did that require? It required the death of the animal, and it required that the blood of the animal be shed. Ever since the garden, all sacrifice pleasing to God and must be accompanied by the shedding of blood. And so blood was shed to forgive Adam and Eve of their sin in the garden. And this is what is now the proper biblical way to sacrifice and worship God. Though Cain brought the fruit of the ground is not the issue. What's the issue is that God had commanded that animal sacrifice and the shedding of blood be rendered. This was the proper form of worship. It was not the proper form of worship to bring the fruit of the ground and offer it. It was an animal sacrifice. Cain disobeyed God, obeyed God, because this was the prototypical form of sacrifice taught to them by their parents because of their experience in the Garden of Eden. There's no other explanation. And so it illustrates that when we're looking at any particular passage, we need to look at other passages to get other insights. And that's what we've just done here. And so Cain's sacrifice was disallowed for two reasons. One, it wasn't the proper form of worship. And number two, he brought it reluctantly and with jealousy and with envy and hate in his brother, towards his brother, because his brother obeyed God. Cain did not. And so great tragedy came as a result. So anyway, I hope that's helpful to you when we are looking at a text in its context. Find out what is the meaning and the proposition so that we can understand the main thing. There are many things in this biblical text that we can learn from, but the main thing is that worship has to be according to God's directives. And if we choose to do otherwise, we're going to be in the way of Cain. What is the way of Cain? Later, much later, in that little book of Jude, written by one who was the stepbrother of Jesus Christ, he talks about Cain. In verse 8, beginning of Jude, yet in like manner these people, also relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of who? They walked in the way of Cain, and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. What is the way of Cain? The way of Cain is blasphemy. Cain was blasphemous. The way of Cain is unreasonableness. Cain was unreasonable. The way of Cain relies on the imagination. Cain relied on his imagination. He imagined that his sacrifice would be acceptable. The way of Cain rejects authority. Cain rejected the authority of God. And the way of Cain is the way of blasphemy. Cain was blasphemous. He was blasphemous because he rejected the authority and the directive of God. He was blasphemous because he hated his brother. He was blasphemous because he ignored God and put himself in the place of God and decided to do what he wanted to do regardless, even though God directly wanted not to. So I hope and pray that this has been useful to you today. God bless you. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow, as the Lord wills, on the Archdale Expositor.